Tack Henrik. Och då får jag säga att jag är väldigt glad att få hälsa er välkomna hit idag från Andersstiftelsens håll. Och naturligtvis speciellt välkommen till Karin Wahl-Jörgensen. Especially welcome to you, Karin Wahl-Jörgensen. I will have this presentation in Swedish, so yeah, I hope that's okay. Jag heter som sagt Victoria Svanberg och jag representerar Ann-Marie och Gustav Anders stiftelse för mediaforskning. Jag är också arbetande vice ordförande i NVT-gruppen. NVT-gruppen består bland annat av 16 lokala och regionala mediehus och ägs delvis då av denna stiftelse som bland annat finansierar Under Visiting Professor. Ann-Marie och Gustav Anders stiftelse för mediaforskning, den grundades i samband med att tidningen NVT fyllde 150 år och det här var 1985. Och sedan dess har den delat ut anslag till forskning och utbildning inom medieområdet för närmare 200 miljoner kronor. Och syftet för stiftelsen är att stödja fri och oberoende journalistik. Och jag vill också passa på att lämna lite kort om NVT-gruppen också. Vår kärnverksamhet är lokal kvalitetsjournalistik och genom det så är vi en viktig del av vår demokrati. Vi är ju, precis som vi alla är, inne i en mycket speciell period under denna coronapandemin. Och vad gäller dagspressen så ser vi att hushållen är som aldrig förr villiga att lägga mer pengar på journalistik än tidigare. Och vi har fler läsare än vi någonsin haft tidigare. Och speciellt då i våra digitala kanaler. Bara som ett exempel så kan jag ta tidningen Nya Värmlandstidningen där vi har en tillväxt digitalt sedan coronautbrottet i mars till idag på 46%. Däremot är det mycket tufft annonsmässigt, vilket tidigare har varit ett väldigt viktigt intäktsben för branschen. Och det här kallar vi nu mer för publicisternas paradox. Vi har fler läsare än någonsin och samtidigt som minskar annonsmängderna. Och för oss då som är lokaltidningar så är inte det förvånande eftersom vi ofta är mer eller mindre en direkt återspegling av det samhälle som vi verkar i. Och när exempelvis handlare får det tuffare så återspeglar det sig på deras möjligheter att investera i marknadsföring och dessutom har en hel del event ställts in som ni känner till, resor, restaurangbesök och så vidare. Men min tro är att med ökat läsarantal så kommer annonsörerna tillbaka när vi kommer ur den här pandemin också, perioden och återgår till något slags normaltillstånd. Intressant är också att flera av de prenumeranterna som har tillkommit under coronapandemin består av nya grupper av prenumeranter för NVTs del. Och för det gäller att 60% av de nya digitala prenumeranterna är under 50 år och 40% är under 40. Så jag kan också säga då att som medieföretag så behöver vi ju hela tiden vara medvetna om och kunna erbjuda vad som engagerar våra läsare. För NVTs del gäller att förutom att vara världsbäst på lokaljournalistik på våra utgivningsorter så ska vi också erbjuda våra läsare en mångfacetterad tjänst. Men i grunden finns alltid kvalitetsjournalistiken som nu också våra läsare visar att de förstår behöver kosta och i allt högre grad och utsträckning är villiga att betala för. Och med den korta sammanfattningen om Andersstiftelsen och NVT-gruppen så hälsar jag er återigen varmt välkomna och ser fram emot den här eftermiddagen tillsammans med er. Och med det så lämnar jag över ordet till André, tror jag. Tack.
Okay, thank you very much. I will shift to English and first of all, I really warmly want to welcome Karin Wahl-Jörgensen to our department and to the Geomedia research group, and we really look forward to hosting you here during this academic year and hopefully also see you live here at the university at a later point. I also want to thank Victoria Svanberg and the Under Foundation for enabling this type of collaboration. Over the years, we have had 12 under-visiting professors, including this one, and it's been very important as one part of establishing Geomedia as an international research environment. The Geomedia Research Group was founded in 2013 and is since 2017 one of Karlstad University's prioritized strong research groups. And what especially makes Geomedia unique is that we bring together media researchers and human geographers to explore the challenges of our digitalized society, not least how digitalization changes the way we live and work, and also how our very life environments are also reshaped. And the relevance of geomedia research has become increasingly obvious during this year precisely because of the corona pandemic, which has led to an intensification of digitalization as well as a redefinition of many of the places we inhabit on a day-to-day basis. Kitchens are turned into home offices. Hotels are turned into hyper-connected co-working spaces. We meet our loved ones online or in public parks rather than in our private homes. And also, as we will see, the ordinary world of journalism is challenged. So to understand the deeper social consequences of all this, I think we must work across disciplinary boundaries, and we must study particular sites and particular groups in society to get at the differentiated picture. And I think this is where you, Karin, can make a tremendous contribution to Geomedia research and to our group during this year. So thank you for these words. I will over to you, Henrik.
Yes, tack så mycket, Andrea. And now I'm going to shift to English. And again, a warm welcome to Professor Karin Wahl-Jörgensen. Karin Wahl-Jörgensen is Professor of Media and Communication in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University in Wales. She is a world-leading authority on the relationship between citizenship, media, and emotion, and how this relationship is affected by technological change and innovation. She has written and edited numerous books, 10 in fact, of which the most recent single-authored book is Emotion, Media and Politics, came out in 2018 from Polity Press. I can highly recommend this book. It is a fantastic account, an overview of the increasingly important role of emotion, emotional appeals in journalism and in politics, with I would say a particular focus on explaining and discussing the rise of populist politics around the world and the way that populist politics interact with media, news media in particular. But she's also written, for example, together with Arne Hintz and Lina Denchik, Digital Citizenship in a Datafied Society. She's written about disasters and the media, and so on, and edited books on mediated citizenship. In addition to this, she's also written over 100 articles and book chapters on various aspects of media and journalism. She is also highly internationally renowned. We are far from the first university to invite Karin as visiting professor. She's also been a visiting professor in Colombia, in Australia, in Denmark, and also in another small Swedish town known as Stockholm. I think if I went on to list Karin's many accomplishments, that would take all of the time allotted for the lecture. So with that, I will stop and again introduce Karin Wahl-Jörgensen, who will talk on the topic of community journalism in the coronavirus pandemic, the importance of places and platforms in covering local news. Very welcome, Karin.
Tusind tak, Henrik, og også tusind tak til Victoria og André, og tak til alle sammen, fordi I er her i eftermiddag. Og som I kan høre, så er jeg oprindeligt dansk, men jeg har besluttet mig for, at det er i alles bedste interesse, at jeg nu skifter til at tale på engelsk. So I'm going to continue speaking in English, and I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Right, so first of all, What I want to do today is to talk to you about the experiences of community journalists in the coronavirus pandemic. But really, firstly, I want to take this opportunity to say that I'm extremely honored to be serving as the under-visiting professor of Geomedia Studies for this academic year. And really, my only wish is that I could actually be there with you in Karlstad this afternoon. But of course, instead, I remain very much delighted to serve as a virtual visiting professor for now, and instead give this talk to you from my home office in Cardiff, wearing my slippers. So I'm really very excited to have this opportunity to share with you some very recent work I've been doing on the practices of community journalism in the pandemic. And what I want to do to begin with is to talk a little bit about my own journey into this topic. So how I came to study community journalism and how it fits within my longer standing research interests. I then want to talk to you a little bit more about the actual project, which involved a very large number of interviews with community or hyperlocal journalists about their experiences in the pandemic. And in doing so, I want to focus on the importance of places and platforms in covering local news. And that in part is something that has to do with a longer standing interest of mine in the local contexts of news production and the importance of place. And hence another reason why I'm very happy to be a Geomedia visiting professor. And specifically, I want to make the argument that community journalists represent a distinctive practice and self-understanding. It's one where journalistic authority and journalistic role conceptions are tied to the places of the local, something which becomes really apparent when you look at the practices of journalism in lockdown, and the kinds of stories that the editors considered important, and also the decisions that they made around dealing with the financial impact of the pandemic. So those are the things that I want to cover in today's talk. I want to start by telling you a little bit about myself and my research, and specifically about how I ended up working in this area. And obviously, Henrik has already provided a very generous and detailed explanation of some of what I'm about, which kind of made me blush. But I wanted to tell you a little bit more about that story itself and how it's led to the work that I'm doing now. So one thing that I do need to stress at the outset is that I'm a journalism studies scholar first and foremost. So that is to say, I've always been informed by theoretical approaches and questions in journalism studies in a way that's always had questions of place at the center. So my research has always revolved around questions to do with the relationship between journalism, citizenship, and democracy. I've put a few of my older book covers here on the slide to the right to illustrate some of these kinds of preoccupations of mine. So that I've done work on things like letters to the editor in the book Journalists and the Public, and on representations of citizens in news, in Citizens or Consumers. But indeed, much of the work that I've done historically has been about local journalism. And that in particular is because I believe that studying the local has always had much to tell us about the role of place and power relations in journalism. And that focus has actually led me to, over time, notice and take very seriously what I've seen as a neglect of research on local journalism. And I think that there are several reasons for the historical neglect of local journalism in research. It is primarily the case that researchers have tended to focus on elite, well-established news organizations and practices. And that has a lot to do with the political economy of academic life. So Put bluntly, it's much easier to get published and get funding and get attention for your research if it's about the New York Times than if it's about the Caerphilly Observer, which is one of the publications I've been studying. And in general, I think it's fair to say that journalism studies has tended to neglect more marginal, struggling or fledgling news organizations and practices. And that is kind of an epistemological blind spot, because it means that we haven't been able to track the diversity of journalism practices and the diversity of ways in which journalists have adapted themselves to changing technological, economic, and social circumstances. However, what we have seen in recent years is a growing chorus of scholars who are calling for research that extends to emerging forms of news practices beyond the traditional newsroom to capture the complexities and dynamism of journalism as an institution. So this is reflected in Mark Döse and Tamara Witschke's call for looking beyond journalism, as well as Hebb and Lawson instigating a big research project on pioneer journalism. For me, studying community journalism is important, not just because of the innovation that it entails, which is often what excites a lot of people, but also because it sheds light on the diversity of practices that constitute journalism and on how these are shaped by prevailing power relations and political economy. Now, this is something that's particularly important to say because of the context of a larger crisis in journalism. So that is to say, in a lot of countries, not including Sweden, I understand that Sweden is a rare example of a country where people continue to buy newspapers, as we just heard from Victoria. News is more important than ever and valued more highly by audiences than ever before. But in general, what we've seen is that the business model of print journalism has collapsed in many Western countries because audiences are no longer prepared to pay for news. And I understand that Sweden is an exception, but we have seen a significant decline in the number of newspapers and in the number of journalists working across many different societies. So in the UK, since 2005, over 245 newspapers have closed shop. Print circulations have halved, and advertising revenues have fallen by 75% over the same period. And since 2000, we've seen national newspaper sales fallen by 2/3. Now, this is a widely told story and a very well-known one, and it's one that's been repeated across the Western world. But what tends to be less discussed is the fact that the crisis in journalism has had particularly dramatic implications for the regional, local, and community newspaper sector. So the UK's National Union of Journalists suggests that the number of regional journalists has halved since 2005. What that means concretely and in geographical terms is that 3 in 5 UK citizens now live in areas that are no longer served by any regional paper. And although the closure and abandonment of major urban newspapers tends to receive significant attention, the hidden story is actually one of cuts and consolidation and closure of local titles. So it's also not just the case that hundreds of newspapers have closed down. Those that continue to operate have cut scores of jobs. And these job losses have disproportionately affected coverage of smaller towns and cities, as well as rural areas. So the areas that have been traditionally most reliant on local news. But at the same time, we see that local news continues to be highly trusted. So a YouGov poll from 2018 suggests that 75% of those polled to trust local newspapers. And likewise, in the UK, we've seen a similar pattern to what Victoria described in Sweden, that 66% of people appreciate and value journalism more since the global coronavirus pandemic began. Now, why is this important? Well, one reason why it's important is that historically, local newspapers have played the role of sharing information in the community, playing a vital kind of civic role. And the collapse of the local journalism industry has actually had serious consequences for the health of local communities and more broadly for democratic societies. So obviously citizens require information not just about what's going on at the national level, but also about what happens in the local communities. And the local newspapers that continue to operate now tend to publish less political news in terms of both quantity and substance, something that informs concerns about political engagement in local communities. Likewise, research has found that the collapse of local newspapers is correlated with a decline in electoral participation and also accountability in local politics. And obviously, more broadly, knowing what happens in your backyard is quite central to local engagement, participation, and social life. And when you see the closure and consolidation of local titles, what you see is that it becomes increasingly difficult for the remaining local journalists to cover even routine news events, things like council meetings, sports events, development plans, and social issues. So the kinds of stories that have been the bread and butter of local journalism for such a long time. And this is something that's particularly important in the context of a crisis like the corona pandemic and the coronavirus pandemic. And there's several reasons for that. So first of all, the pandemic unfolds within what Andrew Chadwick has talked about as a hybrid media system, where traditional news media compete with online and social media. In that environment, audiences are faced with what is now being referred to as an infodemic of misinformation, including fake news and conspiracy theories. And this obviously makes reliable news all the more important. And local news in that context is especially vital for several reasons. First of all, one reason is that people, at least in areas where lockdown measures have been in place, have been compelled to stay in the local areas. So stay local has been a big motto that's widely used across UK communities to refer to these rules and regulations. Certainly in the UK, we've heard a lot of stories around Sweden having taken a distinctive path in its management of the pandemic and hasn't actually had a legally enforced lockdown as such. But obviously many countries around the world did go down that path. And in the UK, we had a particularly strict and long-lasting lockdown, which is now coming back into place again in response to the second wave. So as we speak, I'm here in Cardiff, where we're not allowed to leave the county. And the vast majority of citizens in Wales are indeed confined to their local area. The same is the case in Scotland now. So during these lockdowns, people have faced various different restrictions, and a lot of that has to do with limiting movement. So this is one reason why the local environment becomes all the more important. A second reason is that the impact and trajectory of the pandemic and the responses to it vary very widely across different communities in the UK and beyond. Also, certainly, I know that this is the case in Sweden, where certain urban areas have been far more hard hit than more rural areas, for example. And then further information about local services, businesses, and mutual aid schemes, for example, is essential given the significant disruption to everyday life experienced by everyone. So in that context, local news is probably more important than it ever has been before. Now, in that context, I think it's particularly interesting to look at the place of community journalism. So what we've seen, this is not just in the UK, but in many countries, particularly around Europe and the US, is that the crisis in local journalism has opened up a space for a novel model for news production, which is something that's particularly accelerated over the last decade. And that is the space for community journalism, which is sometimes referred to as hyperlocal journalism. So journalism that tends to cover very confined geographical areas and where outlets tend to be fairly small in terms of their operations. There are now actually more than 400 such publishers in the UK. Amongst the community journalism organizations that I studied and I'm talking about today, a handful had been in operation for more than 20 years, so they've been around for a long time. But most of them have been established since 2010, in large part due to the affordances provided by technological transformations. So we've seen, for instance, the launch of blogging platforms like WordPress, which has made it easy and inexpensive to set up a slick news website, and therefore reducing entry barriers. So making it easier for someone to sit in their home office or their kitchen and set up a swanky looking news website. Now, it should be said that most community journalism outlets are small in terms of their geographic and population's reach. They tend to focus on areas ranging from small towns to neighborhoods in major metropolitan areas. But despite the fact that individually they tend to be quite small operations, collectively they actually reach a significant proportion of the population. So their reach extends to 14.9 million people in the UK, or more than 1 in 5 of the entire population. What's also important to note about them is that these are very financially precarious organizations. They're often operated by just one individual, usually a bloke, usually a man. This one person does all the work for this publication. So they frequently see their existence as being under continuous threat and are just frequently scrambling along, doing whatever they can to survive. So at the same time, however, like other entrepreneurial small-scale businesses, they also tend to be agile and flexible in their ways of working, precisely because of their small size. So that means that they can rapidly innovate and change their ways of working. So that's something that I found in my research, is that they tended to be much faster at changing what they were doing because they were able to do so within the structure of this very small news organization. Now, in my research, which was funded by a small grant from the British Academy COVID-19 scheme, I was specifically interested in the experience of these practitioners in the pandemic. Like others, I see the pandemic as an unprecedented moment of crisis where journalism is more important than it ever has been before. And obviously, in the case of community journalism, it's also one that dramatizes the precarity of that sector. So in my research, I explored questions around how the pandemic changed the role of community journalism, how it changed the ways of working of community journalists, and how it shaped the financial situation of these news organizations. So I just want to provide a few details about what research I actually did. First of all, we did a lot of interviews with members of the Independent Community News Work. And the Independent Community News Work is an organization which basically serves as the advocate for community journalists in the UK. So it has currently 123 members, all of which are well-established community news organizations. So that means that the people that we interview represented the best established of these community journalism outlets. So we did a total of 59 interviews between July and September 2020. About half of them I did myself, and then the other half were done by colleagues, including Dr. Iñaki Garcia Blanco and Dr. Julia Böller, who was hired as a researcher for the project. So a couple of things to note about that. One is that we did interviews with a very substantial proportion of the members of the Independent Community News Network. So we get a pretty good sense of the kinds of experiences of well-established community news organizations. Another thing to note is that we have only just finished doing these interviews, and we have a hell of a lot of data to go through. So what I'm presenting here today is more of a preliminary scramble through that data rather than a very systematic analysis because there's just so much to say on this. So what follows is a sort of preliminary thematic analysis of the data where I've taken a particular interest in something that from the beginning struck me as a key set of themes around the importance of the material places of the local in terms of shaping the practices and the self-understandings of these practitioners. So the first thing I want to talk about is really this question around how the practices of community journalists changed in the context of the lockdown and how that reflects their distinctive relationship to the place of the local. So in the UK lockdown, people were allowed 1 hour of daily exercise outdoors, and they were not allowed to travel outside of their local area. And faced with these kinds of restrictions on movement, the most important one being the fact that they could only be outside for 1 hour, the first and most obvious challenge had to do with how do you actually cover the news in those circumstances. And a lot of the editors felt quite strongly that being out there on the ground, walking the streets, walking the patch of their community was actually quite essential to their work as a reporter. So they were unable, many of them were unable to do that or had to think creatively about how to actually walk around their communities. So you could see very clearly in the accounts of the interviewees that for them, the spaces of the local itself were kind of imbued with a strong cultural meaning. And this is something that Nikki Usher has written about quite compellingly, but something that became very evident in my interviews. So I wanted to talk about a couple of examples of what I mean by that, because it does sound a little bit abstract. So one example is that of Alan McIntosh, who's the editor of the Broughton Spurtle, which is an outlet covering a neighborhood in Edinburgh. Now, Alan had to relocate to a different area within the city to care for his elderly patients parents in lockdown. So what that meant was that he was unable to walk around the neighborhood that his news outlet actually covered. And he really missed walking around to document what was going on. And for Alan McIntosh, the experience of being on the ground in a local community was also one of being in touch with the history of the city. So he's someone who is a very keen kind of local historian. And he reminisced about the kind of reporting that he liked to do that was premised on walking around his patch. So he said, when I go walking around my bit of the city, I've got the city in front of my eyes, which is happening now, which I report on. But under that, I've got a layer of a 19th century city populated by people I've encountered through the graveyard. And the image that I've got on the slide here is of a tombstone that he found in a Victorian graveyard in Broughton. And that is a tomb of Jock Porter, who was the first Scot to ever enter the Isle of Man tourist trophy. And so he was very proud of the fact that he had uncovered the history of this forgotten historical figure who kind of coexisted with the contemporary lives of people in this city. And indeed, many editors use this daily exercise to, as they put it, walk the beat and being out and about. Now, James Hatts, who's the editor of the Bankside Press in London, was very proud of winning what he saw as a scoop while he was walking his beat. So he came out with a scoop. Basically, the Royal Mail, the postal service in the UK, had painted selected post boxes blue when they're usually red. And the color blue is the color of the National Health Service. So they were basically doing this in order to honor the work of the National Health Services during the pandemic. Now, James Hatts found the first such painted postbox in London during one of his daily walks, during his daily exercise. And he photographed it and shared it with his audience. It got loads of hits, loads of people shared this, and he was very proud of this. And what he concluded was, so sometimes it's fun to just be slightly ahead with these things simply because you happen to be there. So to me, this was quite interesting because it reflected the pride of getting a scoop because of being there, because of connecting with the material spaces of the community. And in many cases, indeed, what I found was that it seemed that much as anything, both the authenticity and the journalistic authority of community journalists was grounded in the materiality of the local. So it was grounded in a very close connection to these local spaces. And indeed, the idea of documenting through photography the dramatic changes in the landscape as a result of the pandemic was something that was repeated across the sample. So another example here is that of Columba O'Hare, and he edits a news site in a town called Newry in Northern Ireland, which is very close to the Irish border. But he's also a photographer who supplements his income from the news site by doing event photography. But obviously at the moment, there are not so many events going on, so that source of income has somewhat dried out. But he basically started this photography series called Signs of the Times, March 2020. And the image I've got up here is from that series. And what he said, I thought was quite poignant. He said, I documented things like COVID-19 testing stations and signs on shops relating to why they're closed, screens being put up, trafficless roads, the layout of queues going into stores, the Archbishop saying Easter Sunday Mass and blessing an empty crowd. And the worrying thing about all of that is that you start thinking, maybe this actually is normal. Have I enough photographs taken in a supermarket before the screens, or don't I? So for him, this was a way of documenting dramatic change, but also kind of made him feel melancholy about the loss of the spaces of the local that were there before the pandemic. Now, like the rest of us, however, the editors had to adapt their work to the digital environment. So the next thing I want to talk briefly about is the platforms of journalism and how they relate to the places of journalism. So obviously, because of limits on their social interaction and their movement around the community, a lot of these editors turn to things like phone, Zoom, and Skype for interviews and information gathering, even if they very strongly emphasized the fact that they missed the social interactions in their communities. Several editors said that they missed going to the pub because that was usually the place where they got the best information. And now instead they had to go to Facebook. It should be said that some community journalists experienced very little change to their routine. So one example of that is Jonathan Shepherd, who is the editor of the very well-established dside.com. And that's an outlet that works in close collaboration with another community journalism site called wrexham.com. And so they've been working very closely together using electronic means for many years. And he said we Zoomed and used Skype before COVID. That's been part of the norm for the last few years for us or for me. So all COVID-19 has done is just create a lot more work. In general, what you saw was that in the place of the social interactions, editors increasingly took to social media, including Facebook and Twitter, to get local information, also to get information about what was happening nationally and internationally, but to find out what initiatives were happening in the local community, they relied very heavily on social media. And a lot of them expressed concern about misinformation that came up on social media. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. So they sort of saw community journalism as and the work that they were doing as a way of countering misinformation on social media. But at the same time, a number of them reported how the pandemic had given them an opportunity to start new experiments using the affordances of social media platforms to stay connected to the community. So the image that I have up there on the slide is of Ben Black, who is the editor of Cwmbran Life. And what he started doing was that he would take his mobile phone with him, as indeed anybody would, on his daily walk around the community. And then he started to actually film little Facebook live videos when he walked around to support local businesses. So he would go around, he would see which shops were open, he would do a little interview with the people in the shops, asking them how they were doing, and then he would post them on the Facebook site for his news outlet, Cwmbran Live. And after he started doing that, he got extremely excited about this as a new kind of opportunity, particularly because his videos generated a lot of engagement on the Facebook pages. And so he's continued doing it. So the picture I've got up here on the slide is a very recent one where Ben went to a local business which does custom-made clothing, and he had a special Cwmbran Life face mask made for him. So for a lot of the editors, the pandemic then represented an opportunity to explore the affordances of platforms as a form of engagement with their community, even if the pandemic also severely restricted their face-to-face interactions. Now, so what I've established so far is that practices of news gathering were very much shaped by restrictions on movement and interaction. And through that, it dramatized for the editors the importance of the connections with the materiality of being on the ground, or as facilitated through social media platforms. But the importance of the local not only shaped reporting practices, but also highlighted the distinctive role conceptions of the community journalists. And this is something, the fact that they had these very distinctive role conceptions became very evident when you asked the editors what they thought were the most important stories that they'd done during the pandemic. Now, there has been extensive research on role conceptions in journalism that has tended to draw on very well-established typologies that have been tested through longitudinal cross-country surveys. And these have identified a series of roles which appear on the face of it to be fairly stable in different countries across different surveys. And to some extent, you can see these role conceptions in community journalism as well, but they don't necessarily map very neatly onto practices of community journalism. There was no real uniformity in terms of what the editors saw as the most important stories that they'd done and how that reflected on their roles in the community. And I want to give some examples of that now. And specifically, I want to talk about 3 distinctive categories of important stories that the editors mentioned, each of which reflects what I see as a distinctive role conception. And I should say that many of the editors might mention several of these different forms of stories reflecting particular values. So each editor could potentially embody several of these roles at the same time. So the 3 distinctions that I want to make here is, first of all, stories that reflected traditional hard news values. Secondly, stories that reflected what we might call crisis journalism values, where the real emphasis was on bringing out information that could save people's lives. And then finally, ones that reflected what I'll call community journalism values, of serving as a kind of promoter, advocate, and cheerleader of the community, helping to manage the emotions of community members at a very difficult time. So first of all, when you ask the editors which stories they did in the pandemic that were the most important, many did indeed talk about examples that highlighted their commitment to traditional journalism values around reporting hard news. So the majority of editors, in fact, stressed the importance of providing reliable and trustworthy information, particularly in the face of widespread fake news and conspiracies around COVID-19 circulating on social media, including in these local contexts. A number of editors were proud of sharing information about the number of local coronavirus cases and deaths. And this is something that was particularly important because some of these communities do not have other local news media that provide that information. So for people in a particular community, that news site might be the only place where they could find out how many cases there were in that community and how many people had died. A considerable number of the editors highlighted examples of kind of what they saw as important scoops that they'd earned. So for instance, Hans Marta, who's the editor of Shed the News, was very proud of getting the story of the people who had first had a positive coronavirus test on the island. So the first coronavirus cases on the island. And apparently big rumors had been flying about the identity of these individuals who were rumored to be very prominent members of the community. He managed to actually get interviews with these individuals about their experience of the illness and the recovery. Jonathan Shepard from dside.com, whom I mentioned before, his sort of proudest achievement was the fact that every day during the lockdown, he had coordinated with his partner organization, Wrexham.com, to ask questions reflecting the concerns of North Wales, the area where his outlet is located, to ask these questions in the daily briefings of the Welsh First Minister. So providing a means of holding the First Minister to account for his actions. And then finally, Kathy Bales, who's the editor of the Isle of Thanet News, was proud that she pushed ahead with a series of stories that covered outbreaks and deaths in a local nursing home. She did that despite the fact that the council wanted her to stop these stories and actually threatened her with legal action. And she said, no, I know I'm on solid ground with these stories. I'm gonna continue publishing about these care home deaths because people need to have that information available to them. But these kinds of hard news stories, which reflect traditional role conceptions, were only one part of the picture. So a second category of important stories that journalists mentioned, which reflect distinctive role conceptions, was that of what I call crisis journalism. And so one of several examples is that of James Cracknell of the Enfield Dispatch and Waltham Forest Echo. And I should say that in the interview, this does not come across when you just look at the text on the slides, but in the interview, he kind of choked up when he was talking about this. So he was close to tears in reflecting on his experience. And so what he said was the following. He said, "The pandemic is the biggest story that's ever happened in my lifetime. So to be reporting on it at the local level means that at the very beginning, I realized that my job was to literally give our readers information that could save their lives. I was like, bloody hell, that's quite a responsibility. You had people stuck in their homes, people who were literally unable to open their front door. Overnight, you had thousands of people in the community who needed help. So I saw the job of us as a local newspaper to give them the information they needed so they could get the help they needed. So the front pages that we did right at the beginning were unlike any journalism I've ever done before. It was a very different type of journalism, and like literally every bit of a story we were writing in the beginning was, how can I give people the information they need that could save their lives? So he gave several examples of what that meant. That included things like giving details of a local mutual aid group, of a food bank, a phone advice line for the elderly, and a home delivery service. And a lot of the community journalism providers shifted to that kind of very basic crisis management mode, where you're no longer a kind of objective actor or watchdog in concentrations of power. Instead, you're merely a conduit for vital information in a crisis. And as James Cracknell points out, this is particularly important in a local context because of the fact that there were people in his community who needed to know about how to access local services. Now, a final and an incredibly common type of story that editors mentioned as important was stories about positive initiatives in the community, what I refer to as stories that highlight a community journalism set of values. So editors who talked in those terms saw themselves as local advocates and promoters first and foremost, trying to cheer up the community at a very difficult time. So here's one example of this. This is a female editor in England, and she talked about how the really memorable story that she had covered was one of a community socially distanced dance. She said it was quite sweet. They organized across social media that they would play a certain playlist at a certain time, and everyone played these tracks across the village. And they all went out into the street and they all did socially distanced dancing. I got a hold of the video and it was our main story, just something a little bit uplifting, even though it was a really gloomy time. And this is something that came up again and again and again, stories that were trying to highlight positive things happening in the community, ranging from local people making personal protective equipment, a local man repairing bikes, and children writing letters to care home residents. So this was a way for the editors to express their role in terms of managing the emotions of the crisis of the community at a moment of crisis. So continuing with that theme, Richard Gerner, who's the editor of the Caerphilly Observer, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, he was recently faced with the reality of a new lockdown in the town. And that was the first kind of second round of lockdowns in Wales because of a dramatic increase in the number of coronavirus cases. So when this new lockdown happened, he wrote an editorial which included quite detailed information about the new and complicated rules for the lockdown. But he also stated that we must all play our part in lifting the doom. So he was sort of trying to call a positive community spirit into being to manage all the negative emotions of the community at this difficult time. Now, so I just want to finish by saying a few things about the financial consequences of the pandemic and how the spaces of the local shaped editors' responses to the financial impact of the pandemic. So obviously it's important to note that the work of these community journalists in the pandemic can't really be understood outside of the context of the precarity of the sector overall. And indeed, as Henrik has written about, the precarity in journalism in general. When the lockdown began in March 2020, a survey that was done by the Public Interest News Foundation showed significant worries about the financial impact on the sector. So many of the editors who were surveyed, which were basically the same people that I spoke to, were concerned about an existential threat to their outlets. But what did happen was that many of the sites, like the Swedish news sites that Victoria was talking about at the beginning, actually reported a massive increase in traffic from the audiences during lockdown. That meant that they got some increased revenue from online advertising, which is not particularly lucrative, but did provide them with some funding. But we did see, again, in line with what Victoria was telling us, a temporary collapse of advertising revenues from local businesses, because basically everything just kind of closed down. So there were no local events. The local businesses all had to stay closed, and many of those that remained open were sufficiently concerned about their financial sustainability not to want to spend any money on advertising. But a number of the editors actually reported that they got new advertisers, and the new advertisers were people who were concerned about the long-term sustainability of the outlets. So many politicians, for example, elected politicians would spend some of their advertising money supporting these outlets. Some other editors mentioned the fact that they had increased funding from care homes and actually funeral parlors as well, which is a little bit of a perverse development. But some editors decided that what they would do was to provide free advertising to local businesses. So I have one example up here of Chris Titley of York Mix, but he's just one of many publishers who decided that they should actually provide that kind of support to local businesses, because if local businesses didn't survive, neither would the community journalism outlets. So in other words, their attempts at safeguarding the economic health of their outlets also rested on the economic health of the community as a whole. There were several examples of outlets that actually benefited financially from the pandemic. So a number of outlets received more grant funding than they ever had done before. Suddenly, councils and charitable foundations had money available to support community journalism because they had recognized the value of those contributions. And so in one case, an editor was able to take time off work. She was able to take the weekend off work for the first time since she started the site in 2017, because she got a grant from the council, which enabled her to hire a colleague from another newspaper to actually go in and cover her for the weekend. Now, what tended to be the case overall is that a lot of the editors felt more optimistic about the future at the end of the lockdown than they did at the beginning. And this was in part because the pandemic was seen by them as bringing home the importance of community news. So they felt optimistic about the future precisely because they believed that the pandemic had demonstrated the importance of the work they were doing and demonstrated that audiences actually wanted access to the news that they provided. Now, so I just want to conclude. I think I'm running out of time as well. Henrik is nodding. What I hope that I've shown today is that the pandemic has been a moment of crisis which has highlighted the importance of local and community journalism. And it's also highlighted the distinctive practices of the sector, which are very much tied to the materiality of the local. What I hope that the research has shown is that we have to be attentive to not just the most elite and fashionable news organizations, but also the more marginalized and less established ones, like community news, to do justice to the diversity of the media ecology. And in my talk today, I've presented what is just a preliminary analysis of a huge pile of data, but amongst other things, through the lens of the experience of community journalists in the pandemic, it tells us, first of all, about the role of places and platforms in shaping self-understandings and practices of community journalism. It tells us about the importance of serving the local community as central to role conceptions. And ultimately, it demonstrates the fact that the materiality of the local in itself becomes a source of journalistic authority and legitimacy. So that's where I'm going to end it today, but I'm happy to take any questions. And I'm going to hand over to, I believe it's Henrik who is moderating it. So tusind tak, fordi I alle sammen lyttede, og jeg glæder mig til at svare på spørgsmål.
Thank you so much, Karin. And what a fantastic data set you have. That's I bet there's going to be some really interesting articles and stuff coming out from this. So as we said, please feel welcome to ask questions in the chat, and I will sort of pass them on to Karin. But first, I also have several questions, but first I think we have a question from Andre.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful talk, and yeah, it was really interesting. I think especially the issue that you ended with, and also that you talked about in the beginning, about this increased sensitivity among the journalists to the very local texture of place was a fascinating part of the talk. And it seems like this kind of sensitivity points to a new type of attachment and reflexivity in relation to place. I also think, I mean, during this type of pandemic, I mean, this is a process which is so charged with a lot of emotion, not only in the local, but also in a grander scheme of things. I was just thinking, in relation to that, it's so easy also to report kind of the wrong things when you're also so very close to your audience as these groups of journalists are. So I was thinking a bit about, I mean, you have interviewed so many of them here, and to what extent did they experience that there was a type of resonance between their reporting and the responses and feelings among other people in the community, and to what extent were there also frictions and different types of conflicts emerging? I mean, this is a really sensitive period to work in, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because that did indeed come up as a massive theme in the interviews, because obviously one of the issues for these journalists is that they're very closely tied to the financial health of the communities. So, and they're also very closely tied to particular individuals in the community. So they tend to be more careful about avoiding offending people. and about picking fights with local businesses and the council. So, and there I would say it's a very complicated picture that emerges, because some of the editors were very proud of having reported investigative stories about wrongdoing in the community, even to the point where they lost advertisers. So one example is someone who reported on dodgy, problematic employment practices at a local car dealership, and then lost the car dealership as an advertiser. But actually, in the context of the pandemic, there seemed to be more of a kind of consensus-oriented kind of spirit emerging, at least over a temporary period of time. So I think that the editors spend a lot of time speculating on what kind of reporting would be most ethical to do. And so, for instance, a number of them stopped reporting on local deaths because they feared that that might be traumatic to people in the community. But overall, there was a kind of a step away, for the most part, from being highly critical of the local authorities, where that had been a practice amongst the community journalists, and towards providing information about what was actually going on in the local community. So I guess a shorter way of answering that question is that these tensions are always there and really relevant in the context of community journalism, but it actually became a little bit less salient because of the impending or the ongoing crisis that they had to deal with.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I can see now that we have several questions from the chat. I'll start with one here. So, Karin, do you think that these changes will increase the quality of journalism overall? And if there are any such changes, will they stay after the pandemic, or will everything just go back to the way it was?
In terms of the providers that I studied, their big challenge is that of financial precarity and not having resources available to them. Over time, over the last 10 years or so, the community journalism sector has indeed grown increasingly professionalized and has come to have more resources available, and therefore providing more quality journalism. I think that in the UK context, one thing that's happened as a result of the pandemic is that national and local governments and also charitable foundations have increasingly recognized that this type of journalism needs to be supported, and so therefore is providing more resources to fund these kinds of outlets. And that is what's going to make a massive difference to the quality of these outlets, because I mean, something I didn't really mention was that in the majority of cases, the editors who run these outlets are former journalists who have either been laid off from larger news organizations or whose working conditions became too difficult or challenging to the extent that they decided to start up their own business. So most of them are actually professionals and know how to do good journalism. But the real challenge for them is how to have enough time to do that when they also, for instance, have to find advertisers and have to distribute the paper as well. So there's just a lot of work to do if you're a one-person band. And so the more resources they have available to them, I think that the better the journalism will be. But I think it's too early to tell what the impact is going to be of the pandemic in terms of that.
Thank you very much. We have another question from the audience here, which is a question around trust, that we can see during the pandemic that trust in media actually seems to be growing, not just like trust of local media and local journalism, but like trust in legacy outlets as well. Why do you think that is? Because there also seems to be a contradiction with the fact that that if press freedom is decreasing in many countries as well, and like harassment of journalism is increasing, and like, you know, established political parties are like often very critical of journalism. But so why is it in this context that people seem to be trusting journalism more?
Well, I think and this is not so much based on this study, because obviously I didn't really study news audiences, but rather based on having spent a lot of time reading about this, because at some point I inadvertently became an expert on media coverage of the coronavirus pandemic, and so was constantly interviewed by the media about this. So I consumed a lot of information and spent a lot of time that I'll never get back looking at the exact kinds of questions. And I think it seems to me that part of what's going on is that people have been starved for information about what's going on in the pandemic. And people have turned to a variety of different news sources, including social media sources, and including sources that have not been particularly consistent about weeding out misinformation. And so as a result of that, I think that there has been a growing recognition among audience members of the need for reliable and trustworthy and verified information, and that indeed a lot of journalists, both from national news organizations, but even these community journalists, now increasingly see it as part of their role to keep an eye on misinformation and ensure that fake news and conspiracy theories do not circulate widely and are kind of taken to task in terms of any poor information circulating in public. So I think that part of it has to do with just the fact that we do need information now more than we ever did, and also we need reliable and trustworthy information. So in that sense, I think that the pandemic has served to vindicate traditional media, both national media and also local media, more than perhaps any other crisis has done, certainly within my lifetime.
Thank you for this very comprehensive answer. There's also a question from Raul. I think Raul would like to ask it in person.
Right. Yeah, it's just a bit easier to explain it than typing it. Thanks, Karin, again for a great research project. You mentioned about how now these journalists are more reliant on the platforms. They were very reliant when social media became very popular. And then in 2008 and 2018, when Facebook changed the algorithm, a lot of news organizations started drawing back towards their proprietary platforms instead of relying from social media. I wonder if they reflected about this process of having to rely again on these third-party platforms, and whether they saw this as a problem, or if they saw this as a safe line, or how did they see that?
I mean, that's a really good question, Raul. And I would say there's not one answer to it. So there were people like Ben Black, who was super excited about the fact that he could do a Facebook Live video going to the local butcher and the sweet shop and show that they're open again. And then there were many others who were extremely critical of social media, particularly Facebook, and were concerned also about how the big online players are increasingly taking all the advertising revenues away from local news organizations. So many of them certainly took a stance where both politically and practically they were extremely critical of what has happened in terms of the digital landscape. But at the same time, that didn't necessarily mean that they didn't use those platforms. So pretty much everyone used either Twitter or Facebook or both to gather information and also to get their message out. But a lot of them were extremely critical, both of the policies of the platform, but also of the content of the platform. And I think in terms of the content, particularly Facebook was singled out as being highly problematic in terms of having local conspiracies around, for instance, stories about a man who goes around coughing on other people, and around ways of curing yourself from the coronavirus. So that kind of stuff. So I think that those two positions often coexisted which was both a critical view of the platforms and a recognition that it would be very difficult not to engage with those platforms.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. And we actually also have a little follow-up question here to the previous question about trust. I mean, you mentioned at the end, Karin, there, or of your answer, that sort of people were like starved of information. And the question we have is, haven't the health authorities provided any information, or are they not trusted? Does that information not get to people, or?
So the health authorities, they do to varying extents provide that information, but it's actually very difficult to access. And so in England, it has become increasingly difficult to get access to the information about cases, and particularly local breakdowns. Even in Wales, the Public Health Wales every day tweets out the daily case numbers and deaths, but then you have to navigate a very complicated system to get local breakdowns. And within the local breakdowns, information about what's going on specifically in, for instance, a hyperlocal area is actually difficult to get a hold of. So it's not that that information is not out there, but it's that it can be very difficult to find, and it requires some technical skills to determine that. And so as a result of that, people seem to rely a lot on community news media to get that information, because they simply didn't necessarily know how to navigate the dashboards of different health authorities, and because the health authorities were, shall we say, unevenly forthcoming with that information.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another question here from a fellow scholar on hyperlocal journalism, Karina Tenure, which is about that we know that visibility is a big challenge for hyperlocal outlets. That is, that like getting, even in the local community, getting people to know that they exist. Did you see anything in your study or indicators about that they sort of, the journalists thought about this problem? Can you relate that to what you already know about the audience point of view, like in terms of like reach, trust, importance to the local audience?
Yeah, I mean, really, really good question, and thanks for that, Karina. So yes, this was a big issue for the editors, and again, social media come into play with that, because for a lot of them, pushing content through Facebook and Twitter in particular, and also in some cases through Instagram, was seen as something that was extremely important in terms of securing their visibility. For other practitioners, they believed that they were well known in the community, and that they didn't need to do anything more to enhance their image. But yes, this was a perpetual concern of a lot of the editors, was how visible are we? How big is our news site? How can we better promote it? And one of the questions that we asked them was, what would you do if you had infinite resources? And this is also relates to the previous question that I answered around the quality of the journalism. But actually, a lot of them talked about how they would like to have more marketing assistance to help, first of all, with advertising revenues, but secondly, also to enhance their social media profile and their just general audience figures. So how do you do that? You need someone who has a skill set that I don't personally have, some of them would say. So yes, it was very much of a salient question for a lot of them, particularly those that were struggling a bit financially.
Thank you. I actually have a question also. I have several, but I'll start with one. I was very struck by what you said in the beginning about the sort of relative neglect of local and community journalism in journalism studies. And I would say that there's another area of neglect in journalism studies. It's gotten a bit better in like the past decade, but I would say that also the visual aspects of news are also, relatively speaking, neglected, like the role of like photos, images, and so on. That journalism studies tends to be sort of focused on text a lot. But I think it was obvious from your presentation that for these community journalists, like without photography, without like live broadcasts, and also without like Zoom and stuff, there would not like be any community journalism. And like even the photo is the news, the blue letterbox, for example. And also you had actually other examples of this as well. And I would like to hear you reflect specifically on how this like visual aspect links to like this kind of emotional aspects, or like community feeling and effect and like connection to community, given that it seems to be so central to the activity of these sites.
I mean, I think, Henrik, that's a really important point. And this is particularly because, like you said, it was something that was actually very salient in terms of the kinds of things that the editors saw as important about their work. So also another question that I asked was, what were the most popular and widely shared of all of your posts? And they were almost always spectacular images. So there's one guy who is up in Scotland, in rural Scotland, and he does a lot of investigative reporting on the development plans of his local council. And he said he was very annoyed about the fact that the most popular post that he'd ever put on his site was a photo that he got of a car that crashed into a house. So that was shared thousands of times on social media, whereas all of his attempts at holding the council to account for its development, maybe were viewed like 800 times or something like that, max. So I think this is very this is a very important point, and also something that kind of, like you said, reflects the emotional nature of a lot of what it means to be a community journalism, because I think that a lot of them talked about how having compelling images creates a kind of emotional resonance, so you can see yourself there. So one editor, for example, he would invite young people in the community to talk about their experience. It was called something like Community Voices. So he would get a guest column every week from a young person in the local community. And for him, it was extremely important that these stories were accompanied by photography, like a photo of a kid on a skateboard or playing the guitar or something like that, so that people could put a face on these voices. So I think that you're right, that is very neglected in journalism studies research in general, but also very much so in community journalism, where it's actually extremely important in terms of audience engagement.
Okay, we're going to wrap up soon, but so I'm going to ask you, I have one last question for you here. We have two last questions. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to give you both of these questions, and then you can like maybe sort of answer sort of both of them together, and then we'll sort of wrap up everybody. So the first question is about the role of, I guess, local municipalities or local councils, what that has been in the coronavirus pandemic. Like in Sweden, for example, the local municipalities would usually have quite big sort of PR and communication offices who have like stepped in really into the, for good or ill, in the gap where many communities have like lost their local newspapers. So that's one question, is about that. What does that look like in the UK? Like the role of sort of local government, if you will. And the second question is about, like, if we look at the opposite of blind spots in journalism research, one thing that we really like to research is like digital stuff, like like content management systems, robot journalism, metrics, like all convergent newsrooms. Do your community journalists discuss digitalization at all? I'm actually also thinking, like, especially since many of them are former journalists. So like when the role of local councils in the sort of hybrid media system, and what your interviewees or respondents think about digitalization.
Okay, very good questions, both of them. So to the first question about local councils, I mean, yes, so local councils do have comms people who have played a very key role in terms of getting out messages about what the council was doing. And a lot of that has been very important, particularly around things like, for instance, changes in the rules or changes in how businesses operate. But they're not necessarily seen as providing as trustworthy information. Or a lot of, so, well, I follow Cardiff Council on their Facebook page, and the people who comment on their posts are singularly scathing in their responses. So there's clearly a need for that type of communication, but clearly it's also no substitute for journalism that does play some kind of role in terms of holding authorities to account. So it's important to have that information out there, and a lot of the times, certainly for the community journalists, having a good relationship with media and comms people working for the local council is actually extremely important in terms of getting access to information on an ongoing basis. So one of the kind of soap operas of the lives of community journalism has to do with their relationship to the spokespeople for local councils. So I think that is an important position, but one that is quite distinctive from more journalistic practices. So in terms of the second question about how these interviews reflect on technology and digital transformations, actually it's a really varied picture, because some of them feel really freaked out about constantly having to stay on top of all sorts of technological developments. And they also actually feel freaked out about the cost of having to buy new software all the time. So many people, when they talked about technology, they talked about the cost of licenses, and also the costs in terms of training yourself to actually learn new things. And so indeed, for some of them, the pandemic meant that they paused their news production, and then they tried to reskill themselves in various different ways. So for a lot of them, they had kind of like a long to-do list in terms of how they wanted to improve their technological skills, and they'd used the pandemic as an opportunity to work on that. However, there was a small minority of these editors who loved technical stuff. And the thing that was their favorite bit about being a community journalist was the fact that they could try out all these new technologies and experiment with things and do exciting new stuff that they could have never been able to do as quickly when they were working as professional journalists. And so they would know all the latest software for data visualization, for example. Indeed, this was a guy from dside.com. Him and his friend from Wrexham.com were very proud of having done the first ever data visualization mapping of dog poo in response to widespread complaints in the local community about a problem with dog fouling. They then carefully collected reports of dog poo in the local area, and then they created this sort of interactive data visualization of dog poo, and then presented that to the council and got the council to clean up and have a dog poo patrol on a regular basis. So for some of these editors, there was some excitement about technological innovation, but for a lot of them, it was just another thing to add to their to-do list and something that seemed kind of quite difficult to achieve. But I would say that most of them probably wouldn't have gotten into doing this kind of work, which they mostly did on a fairly entrepreneurial basis without having fairly strong skills to begin with. So in that sense, they tended to be quite open to forms of innovation.
Okay. thank you very much for that, Karin, for an incredibly rich presentation and also very comprehensive answers to the questions. Thank you to everybody who asked questions. And also, then I also want to say thank you to Maria Kull at the Conference and Events Unit, and Elisabeth Hall, and the technical support staff, Erik, Christer, and others who helped set this up. And a big thank you also to Victoria, of course, and the Under Foundation for yet again making it possible for us to invite, I think, a highly qualified and nice scholar as Under visiting professor. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for having me, and I hope to be able to be there with you in person before the year is out.
Yeah.
So I really hope to be physically in the material space of Karlstad.
Yes.
Opposed to joining you virtually through the wonderful technology of Zoom.
We are also hoping that we're hoping that things will be better in the spring. Yeah. So thank you everybody. Thank you very much.